Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming out on this chilly January evening, and welcome to everybody who's joining us on Zoom. This evening, we are privileged to have Dr. Chuck Stead here. He was raised in the village of Hilborn, New York, and earned his doctorate at Antioch School of Environmental Studies in Keene, New Hampshire. An educator, historian, and storyteller, he spent years investigating Ford Motor Company's impact on the watershed and upon the Turtle Clan of the Ramapo Lenape Nation. He helped bring about a $40 million cleanup in Torne Valley, New York, and has written a book about the cleanup called Get the Lead Out. He also worked for the town of Ramapo, where he reassembled a 200-year-old ironworks salt box house that was dedicated as an environmental research center. Currently, he is an adjunct professor at Ramapo College in Mahwah, as well as at Marymount in Manhattan and the University of Montana. He is teaching sections of world sustainability, ecology, society, and the sacred, as well as global ethics. He continues to advocate for recovery of our watersheds. Please welcome Dr. Stead.
I went for a doctorate. I wasn't going to do that. It's a lot of work, you know, and I could teach with a master's, and that worked fine for me. But doing this project, it occurred to me that I needed resources and contact people that were on a whole nother level than I had been on. And you'll see some of this as we reflect on this. And so I decided, okay, that's the next step. I'm going to work on that. And it was a number of years, of course. And it coincided with the work that I was doing on the cleanup. So it did play together. It's kind of interesting and relatively transparent when the same regulators, government people, industry people, folks from Ford Motor Company, folks from EPA, the same people suddenly realize they're talking to a doctor of studies. All of a sudden, they served me like crazy. All of a sudden, when I requested information, I got it a lot faster. I, of course, think that's absurd. I'm the same person. But what I'm telling you is it worked. It did make a difference. And that was good. That was good because I'm in debt. So, so that was good. All right, so we're going to start right here. Y'all know Ford Motor Company was here from 55 to 80, a 25-year run. Why do automobile companies leave a place after 25 years? Well, the rest of the story is going to show you why. During that time, they stockpiled paint sludge in thousands of 55-gallon drums at the back of the plant. It's a mixture of lead, volatile organic compounds, plasticizers. All this stuff was taken off, legally and illegally dumped. This is important because in some places where it was quote unquote legally dumped, it's still illegal. It's still a poison. It's still a toxin. But what that means is a municipality played a hand in it and took money for it. And that's a big problem. And we'll get to that too. Who did it affect? Everybody, mostly, though the reason it affected Ramapo Munsee Nation members mostly is because they lived in remote areas where a lot of the stuff was dumped directly. For example, in Ringwood. The folks of the Turtle Clan are literally living on top of a Superfund site. I liken that to Lake Charles, Louisiana. Those folks, thanks to what Goodrich has done down there, are literally living on top of a Superfund site. Why is that still going on? Well, they're poor. They're really poor people. And our agencies, our regulatory agencies, well, you know, they need a little this to move them along. So the paint was hauled to landfills. It was disguised as clean backfill. 250,000 tons were dumped in the O'Connor waste field, Cannon and Peters mine. That's in the Ringwood area. And another 100,000 tons was dumped in Torne Valley. That's in the New York area. Just to look at this truck here for a minute, You see it's tarped on the top and it's a landfill. The O'Connor waste field was a landfill. And you residential stuff that you could throw out, maybe some construction stuff. And then they would haul in backfill to pack on top of it. They call it a landfill, but it's really not just filled with land, it's filled with the garbage. And what they were doing by the 1970s was it was painfully, everyone was painfully aware that this was toxins. So what they would do is they would fill, this was after the drums. You're going to see the drums in a minute, but they would fill the trough of the truck up to about where these turnbuckles are with paint sludge, all kind of liquidy like, thick and liquidy. And then they'd throw plywood on top of the sludge, and then they would throw the backfill on top of the plywood. And then when it was brought up to the O'Connor waste field, the inspector, who I guess worked for the municipality of Ringwood, yeah, that's right, who actually worked for the town, would climb up on the truck and stick a 12-inch probe into 24 inches of soil, preventing him from ever hitting the wood down there. And then he would hop off and say, "It's clean," and they would go on. Except the paint is rich with acetone. Your eyes would be burning before you climbed up on the truck. So a lot of that was going on, a whole lot of that. Also, the road, Peters Mine Road, to get up there goes through the community of the Ramapos. This is where the children are. The parents would call them in when they could smell the trucks coming. Before they got there, as they're coming up the hill on a good breeze in the wintertime, they could smell the acetone wafting up the hill. So this is my friend Jeff Welch. He's the chair of the Ramapo River Committee. He took a number of the photographs in this presentation. And it was during the 1980s, he was instrumental in getting a Superfund site declaration. That's an EPA, it's a federal site declaration, located in Torne Valley, New York. That's the New York side of the dumping. But he got it up there for a big landfill, and a federal cap was put on top of this dump. As you can see, the construction materials that were in the dump that were up there on the Torne Valley Road were laced with asbestos. Oh, and look at these things. You're going to recognize these names. Pharmaceuticals from Ledley Lab. A lot of pharmaceuticals were eventually found in there with the soil probing. And Avon Cosmetics. We could talk if you want during Q&A about what's toxic in cosmetics, because there were plenty of toxins in those cosmetics buried there, but the bottom layer was paint sludge. And this is Tom Franklin. He's a photojournalist with a Bergen record. He spent a good number of years documenting the Ford pollution sites and its impact in local community. And this is a shot right here of the meadows of Hillburn, New York, which means it's right over the state line from Mahwah, which is, of course, where the site was, where the foundry was. And here is a shot of the same thing I was just talking about. If you look way up here, you can see the fence line. That would be the state line right over there. And these are barrels of paint sludge that laid there from the, well, let's get the years correct, from 1968 until the early 1990s. And as you can see, look, the colors on them, there's all gray paint sludge that's there. And kids live down there. There are 14 families down there. And the contents of the barrels were reported into the New York State DEC in the mid-90s. I went with a bunch of kids, Dano, a bunch of kids from Nature Place State Camp and their parents, put them in gloves and masks, and did a videotape of them talking about what Ford left here. I almost got arrested for that one, but it brought attention. DEC was furious with me. Furious with me. Our regulatory agencies, their mission statement is to work defending the earth and the health care of the people. And they were furious with me, and that's because they knew about it. And then they had to do something about it. So by 2005, and they did, they removed all those barrels. But by 2005, I'm teaching at Ramapo, and dirt bikers, quad riders and such, were riding in the same place right over there in the meadows. And look, their trails were kicking, oh, this doesn't work. They were kicking up paint. That's a big chunk of paint sludge. It references in the text. They were discovering paint sludge. I went down there because I wanted to figure out a way to police the area so they would stop riding their quads through the river, because that's an important part of our river corridor, and we didn't want quads going through it, and found out a lot more than I expected, because I had been told by DEC, we got rid of those barrels, we did an aeration tower, there's nothing else there. As you can see there from the description, the embankment, which is 10 to 12 feet high and courses more than a few hundred yards, that's this embankment, was entirely paint. they didn't do much of an inspection when the DEC came in. They just took the barrels I found for them. This gives you an example of the size of what you're looking at. That's a foot measurement. And I don't know if you can see it here, but it's been gnawed. It's been gnawed. When the stuff is soft, lead is sweet. When the stuff is soft, the animals will lick it. When it hardens, they will gnaw it. We found a lot of deer tracks and deer scat, so the deer were gnawing at the lead. We could talk about the deer in Ringwood that wind up with massive numbers of tumors going through their intestines and stomach and through their tracks and everything else from eating the paint sludge, which, by the way, is still there in Ringwood. There's good part to the story too, but we'll get to it. And this is back in the meadows again. Okay, it was one of Ford's first dump sites. Now look what the meadows is. It's a floodplain. These houses are built up on 4 to 8 feet in height on these concrete embankments. So the water comes in. When I was a kid, I'd go down and play in the meadows with some of the Ramapo kids, and I'd see every house had a rowboat. And the river is right on the other side, but it's just the little Ramapo River, you know. And I'd say, wow, all these people have rowboats. And a car on one side and a rowboat. And I'd say, how come everybody has a rowboat? And the kids would say, for the floods. Because they were frequent enough, especially in the thaw. They were frequent enough, which means all the houses got flooded. Cindy Fountain grew up. She's a Ramapo who grew up in the meadows. She spent her earliest years in the meadows, maybe up until about the time she was 5. A lot of time there. I went to she's a 5-time cancer survivor, and last year she passed. Last year she passed. She fought it for crazy all her life. All kinds of cancers. I went to the house that her uncle and aunt owned when I was doing my work in the field there. We got into the well because they were all drinking well water. We dug into the bottom of the well. We did core sampling of the soils there, rich with lead. So burying the lead in the soil, it mixed in the aquifer, and it migrated into the water that people were drinking. And that's how Cindy Fountain, no doubt, was exposed. And behind the Ford plant, excuse me, is that's where they used to burn. This is from the 60s, 50s and early 60s. They burnt a lot of their trash. And when they burnt their trash, what they did was they burnt a lot of paint. So anybody in that area, and it wafted right up. When the fires were going on in the meadows, if your laundry, you remember people had laundry lines out in the lines, they would wind up with dust all over their laundry, and that was lead dust from the effluent, from the burns. And now today, there's these power lines going back and forth across there. And we've done some soil sampling down there in the wild invasives that are down there, and we've still found traces, not nearly as much as was there, but we still find traces. So this is the sort of pickup truck that can accommodate 6 of the 55-gallon drums off the back of the Ford platform. I was told by 3 different people who participated in dumping, because if you do this stuff long enough, eventually everybody talks to you, that in 1962, you could get a $100 bill if you made 6 barrels go away. There were a lot of barrels behind Ford, there were hundreds, but, and they're not filled all the way up, they're filled 2/3 of the way up because it's lead paint, it's heavy. And when I was trapping as a boy, I came across 2 trucks, a GMC and a Ford, and they both had half a dozen barrels in them up in Torne Valley, tarped over. And being a little renegade, I saw that they had keys in the ignition. I didn't know why that was, but of course I took off my pack and I climbed into the truck to turn it on, to hell raise. And when I did that, I got afraid. If the keys are there, maybe the people are in the woods, you know, and they're going to come and beat me. I was 10 years old. So I jumped out, but then I got curious what was in the back, and I climbed up on the bed of the truck, and I never looked under the tarp because the stench, it must have shifted the liquid. The stench from the amount of acetone, you know, like nail polish remover, in the paint immediately burned my eyes. And that's what they were burying. So there I am, 11 years old, up in Torne Valley, and I trapped and I hunted and did all that good stuff that boys do growing up in Hillburn. And I kept a journal because I was also a big advocate of studying nature. And in this section of my journal, which I still have, of course, you can see that I was actually drawing dumping activities. I saw it going on firsthand. So I eventually testified about this. But that's considered anecdotal. Even this illustration, which was drawn in 1964, is considered anecdotal. So using this as a source point, we had to gather the data. We had to lay down all of the data and do the analysis. So we went back to an early map. This is a map from the 40s that I used to show you because it doesn't have the throughway on it. You can see the Ramapo River is in there. Went back to an early map. The blue line, as it says, is the Torne Valley Road, the access road. And all the red X's indicate places where I saw activities. In fact, that truck story I told you is almost off the map. It's right down there. I was right near the entrance. What's important about this map actually is it shows, as they understood it in the 40s, that's what the blue shading is the aquifer. So as you can see, all the stuff is either buried in the aquifer or right along the edge of the aquifer, directly into the groundwater. Some of the contaminated 55-gallon drums were given a cursory cleaning, converted into camp stoves, and no one who built these camps survived to tell the stories. At one point, I got it in my head that I wanted to own one of these stoves. I got talked out of it because metal is porous, so there's no way that they wouldn't have been contaminated. Imagine sitting in your hunting cabin late, after a cold winter, and you come in from hunting and you've got the stove going. You're the effluent, you're inhaling lead. I didn't talk to any family that had anybody that lived beyond 50 that had these camp stoves. This is my brother-in-law, Tony. He worked for the Ramapo Land Company, the heir apparent of the Ramapo Ironworks. And this picture is from 1969. The land company had him cleaning up the area of one of the quarries so it could then be used as a landfill for the county because they were shutting down the Spring Valley incinerator at that time. And the town was taking over one of the landfill areas rather the sand quarry areas in Torne Valley to turn it into a landfill. But Tony had to go in first because there was lots of erosion. And here he's measuring the depth down to, see down here, the bluish gray, down to where the paint sludge was. I never understood that photograph when I first saw it in 1969. I thought he was being an archaeologist. I thought this was so cool. He told me on his deathbed, he was told to go in and remove the paint because the land company knew where there was paint. Because again, some of this was going on with those 55-gallon drums. He removed it. His second wife, not my sister, his second wife remembered him coming home during the summer of 1970 when he was doing that work. It was a hot summer. It was very dusty doing that work. And he always came home coughing color, spitting color. He got bloody nose a lot. That's the antimony that's in the paint. That's mixed in with the lead to harden it. He got earache sometimes. And his trousers, they put a washing machine in the basement. So when he came in, he'd come in through the cellar door and throw the trousers in right away. And it actually even clogged the machine at one point. So much stuff came out of the trousers. When I learned all of that, Tony was gone. I contacted that woman who was his second wife, and she was going to talk to me. And somebody got to her and she was afraid and said she would not talk to me. You judge what that means. But I also learned that the three people who were his ground crew, Tony was operating the backhoe, the three people that were his ground crew all died before he did, and all of them had one thing in common, lesions. They did autopsies. They found lesions all over the place. Tony knew what happened. He figured it out, but he didn't talk about it until he was almost gone. That's money. But these are the people that are hit the hardest, our Ramapos, our Ramapo nation. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. Now, back to the meadows. By the late 90s, thousands of tons of toxic material were removed. When we first talked to Ford about it, nothing was there. They sent in their engineers, nothing was there. By the late 90s, pressing them with the town of Ramapo, which used to be a little less corrupt than it is today, there was some pressure put upon them, and they came back. Ford came back. Oh, they happened to find thousands of tons at that point, and they removed it all. Ultimately, there is no fabled way to get rid of it. It all has to be put into places for containment. I can answer questions about how that's done when it's all separated, but that's why it's expensive. Ultimately, that's an expense that's out there waiting for you if you're in this business. So by 2005, in the Torne Valley, I brought some students from a school in Terrytown, Hackley School, with me too, and their parents. And I geared them up in safety gear to look through the journal, to start looking in the Torne Valley to see if we could ascertain where those areas were that I had written about. Because I'd already talked to DEC and they'd already said, you have to put stuff together here. You know, you have to create essentially not just a line of authority in your mind, but a line of data that indicates what actually happened. So these students helped discover some of the sites. This is Zoe. This is why it's good to teach people how to do this, because they sometimes do it much better than you do. I walked past this because I wanted to show Zoe where the material was dumped into the Torne Brook. And she said, but professor, what about this? And I looked back, look what she's standing next to. That's all paint sludge. Looks like a rock. It's all sludge. But as it turns out, you can see it there. You can see it poking up in the leaves. And as it turns out, this entire mound was paint sludge. As it turns out, when we got excavating it, it went down another 14 feet. And it went out another 300 feet. This was just breaking surface right here. And you can see the other students are finding the stuff and they're looking at it. And the field studies of the sludge that germinated from the journals that I had from years earlier indicated in the field there was a much wider footprint of contamination. And next was to develop a timeline. So this is when I'm starting to talk to Antioch, and I'm talking to toxicologists, and they said, if you develop a timeline, then you can indicate who played a hand in this and who didn't, and that might help you in terms of going back and finding out who's responsible for this. Because the land company that obviously took some money on this doesn't have the money to do this excavation. Ford has the money, so you're gonna have to go up to the deep pockets, but they're gonna wanna know, well, who, what, when, and all that sort of stuff. So this is a mound of paint sludge. You can see some of it in a few spots sticking up right there, and a tree grows on it. So to develop, and moss will cover it. It's very tricky. You got to go through and find a mound that looks unusual, an undulating area in the earth that doesn't look like it's a natural area, and then peel back the moss and see if that's paint sludge. And so what we did is we started identifying the trees that grew on top of it. The oldest tree would give us, nobody buries paint under a tree that's already growing. So the oldest tree would give us a timeline as to when the paint was dumped there. And we literally needed to push it back, well, to get the town of Ramapo to stay on our side and to get their law department to work with us, we needed to exonerate them. Because there were different people 37 years ago running the town. We had to make sure that they didn't take any money, clearly. So they didn't have authority over this property until 37 years ago. 38 years ago, they had no authority over the property. So we had to push it back that far so that they would feel, okay, we can go after Ford now because we didn't do it. They didn't even know if they didn't do it, but let's prove that they didn't do it. And what we did is we cored the trees so we could get a proper date on the trees. And you pull out a core that's at diameter breast height. Actually, there I'm doing one much lower though. And you set it in the tray. You count back from the pith, and you count the number of rings. And eventually we found, moving through it quickly here, eventually we found that there wasn't a tree under 37 years. Some of them were a little over 37 years, but as long as there was one tree on a mound at 37 years, we knew that paint was buried before 37 years ago. And that was important just to take the onus of responsibility off the town of Ramapo, because we want to keep them with us. You know, we need political support on this. And then while we were there, we did some test pits ourselves, handheld test pits to find out where the material was. It's mixed in the soil in different places, but then we also found where there was a continuous pour. That was a new thing to me. I knew it was mixed up in the soil, but I didn't know that they actually poured a lot of it out, like that truck I showed you earlier, into a trench. I remember when I was a kid, I saw where the trenches were dug and the barrels were heaped, but I didn't know the trenches were used for pouring. Oh boy, were they used for pouring. So there was an indication of industrial signature, and that was important too, because when we found, like, this thing is an auto window mechanism, but we found various pieces of car parts that had serial numbers and identification on them that were tossed in with the paint. Now, I had a little girlfriend when I was in Hilbert, and her father worked in maintenance at Ford. And he told my uncle that sometimes he shovels up car parts with ID numbers on it and tosses it into the barrels of sludge. My uncle said, well, what are you doing that for? And he said, industrial signature. Somebody will get the bastards. And that turned out to be that somebody. So that's part of the industrial signature. And I like this. The beer can helps date it too, because it's the kind you use with the opener. It's not a flip top. So that puts it right into the middle 60s. And we did a lot of field study. We took a lot of samples. And we set up a lab in Sloatsburg. And in the lab, we were trying to deal with, to determine the material stage of decomposition, because as it breaks down, one of the things that Ford had said was this material you may claim there are a lot of volatile organic compounds, VOCs, in this material, but they all burn off. They volatilize because they're volatile. So the only thing you've got in there are coloring agents and lead. I didn't believe that. So what we had to do was analyze all of the pieces to find out what happens to them. Like acetone. You know, if you leave a jar of nail polish remover open overnight, in the morning it's empty. Well, it's not empty, it's in the room and you're breathing it. You know, that's where it goes. But the acetone in the paint hadn't left. You could snap a piece of paint in your hands. You could snap a piece of paint that was 60 years old and you'd smell fresh acetone. That was amazing, and that's because it's a DuPont product. That has to do with the plasticizers that were put in the paint. That's what contained it. When I told that to DEC and Ford, Ford said, well, then it can all be captured, as if they were going to go out and capture it. But no, that's not the issue. When you put it in the ground and it softens up, the materials, all the chemicals can then migrate from the paint and not be volatile into the air. They can just start to migrate. And we were finding that to be true too. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have, like it says there, a mass spectrometer. Even for a while, the college wasn't cooperating with me. Couldn't get DEC to do analysis in a lab. Got Cornell to do analysis in a lab until they found out that DuPont made the paint. And then they threw out all of the samples because DuPont gifted them their chem lab. So we kept running into those things. So I bought all these handheld tests and I found out that all our material ranged the highest it could on a handheld test, and that was 50 parts per million, ppm. That's dangerous. 3 ppm is dangerous. So 50 ppm was clearly dangerous and indicated this was lead. But as you can see in the last line, when we were working with Ford years later, 8,000 to 28,000 parts per million was what they discovered with their spectrometer. And the soil samples were important, and we cut them down so you can see the paint here. And we cut down with a core, an auger, and this is cut through the loam on top. Here's the paint that has drifted down on top here where it's cut was where the paint was. So you can see it's migrating. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's getting into the clay. This is the sandy clay right down in here, and it's starting to trail in that way. Ford sat across from the table. An environmental scientist sat across from the table with me and said, this stuff does not move. And I said, so in other words, you've defeated the laws of thermodynamics. And he said, oh, don't be a smart aleck. But it does move, and we found many indications. Now, over 40 years, it moved about 18 inches, that you could find it clearly. But when you did a deeper core, you could find it was saturated and moving in the soil because you get readings on it. The thing is, as it gets smaller and particleizes, it moves much faster. So you need to get, it was in a well field in Torne Valley. You'll see that in a minute. We needed to get out of there before it got much deeper. And then we set up another lab in Harmony Hall inside the building. And I had students working on this, studying the particleization of the material. This is the well field I just mentioned. So if you go up the thruway, this is exit 15A. That's Torne Mountain right up there on the top. And that's exit 15A, and that's the thruway, and that's 17 and the railroad track. And the Valley Road goes up, that way, right up there. That's the Superfund site. That's the capped landfill. And there are two sites. The well field is right here. It's in the basin between the mountains. This is the well field. And this site is the area up in Torne Valley, which is the riparian corridor, what helps feed the well field. If it's a topo map, you'd see that all on those lines. So it was important to continue public education during this time because there were phases where the town would get a little scared. They'd feel like they were going up against Goliath, and DEC would start to even get a little cold feet. So we did a lot of public education, worked with a lot of schools. Here it is, Nature Camp. There's Ed right there, director of Nature Camp, Nature Place Day Camp. And we brought a lot of schools and camps to the site and told them what was going on, and then told them, go home and tell your folks. And there were phases where I was just handing out cards with congressmen's phone numbers on them. Pester the hell out of them. go do all of this, and a lot of people did do that because I'd eventually hear from the other end of things that I was being a pain in the tuchus. And that's wellfield. Oh, that's where I was. That's wellfield number 97. And there it is again. So look at that wellfield. All of that soil has got paint buried in it. That was before excavation was started. Everything there. That's a wellfield. 40 million gallons of water a day that you are drinking come from that wellhead. The pipe only goes down 80 feet. The plume that they're accessing is 80 feet down. The paint's buried maybe 6 to 8 feet, but as it breaks down, it continues to go down. And in dry time with high draw, those water droplets, those particles of water get pulled down. We know this because we measure the height of the Ramapo River, and we have two weirs that are measuring it, one above the wellheads and one right over in Suffern. And we can tell when the water in the river is being drawn down. And that's when you got to cut back on what you're pulling from the wellhead. So we know it's measurable, and we know it can migrate. So in this picture, it's sort of interesting. Ford didn't want to do a survey of trees because if they agreed, we're now in negotiations. And if they agreed, they'd have to replant the forested area because the entire area is a well area and it needs good rooted stocky plants and so forth. And they said there's nothing but garbage trees. That was an interesting meeting when the scientist said there's nothing but garbage trees there. And I said, I don't remember learning about that species in botany class. Can you go a little further? How do you say that in Latin? And busted their chops, but they didn't want to do a survey. So the town supervisor said, you do the survey. And I did. And I got students to do it. I taught them how to do it. And they identified all the plants. But look what else they identified. Outside the footprint that Ford said they'd be willing to dig up, she finds this, which turns into this, which turns into that. A massive area where it was poured directly into the Ramapo River. Ford, do your damn tree thing and tell them you just found 5 different kinds of trees and walk away. But by getting the kids to do it, I really wanted the kids to do it all along, but I pretended I wanted Ford to do it, and so then they, it would have cost them $1,700 to do a treaty survey. This cost them millions. It goes down into the river. You can see what we discovered. After Hurricane Irene, the bank was terribly eroded. It broke up what was going on there, and we found the trail. That picture there shows you the slab. That's the very edge of the slab that's coming down into the river. We waded out in the river. We found chunks of it floating in the not floating in the bottom of the river. And so I put up a siltation fence. That was interesting because Ford is now starting to take an interest. And they said, he has no right to put up a siltation fence. Fine. Are you putting up one? No, we're not designated to put up one yet. So we put up a number of them. And then they had to put up one. So a storm came and wiped out ours, and they did full geotextile there and covered the whole area up. This area alone had about 3,000 tons because that whole bank had to be dug out. It was a trough. They were pouring paint into the river. I went down to the dam, the 4th Street Dam, and did sediment tests for the material that was backed up in the dam. Didn't find much. Found little bits. Didn't find much. That's because the dam had been blown out. So you might find some of it in, I don't know, Pompton Lakes, wherever the next dam is. I mean, it would just keep going. This was interesting. This is a photograph of the upper region. Ford had now agreed, thanks to a man I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes, they had agreed to do a laydown area, remove material, analyze it. They're not allowed to take it off the area under DEC's authority until it's been thoroughly analyzed so they can know where it's going to go to. But they just wanted to cut down the brush and lay it down on the soil. I said, no, that's a floodplain. Ford, using the most recent geological survey maps, indicated this area is not a floodplain. Only the very bottom of the well field is a floodplain. The upper area is not a floodplain. Those maps are 30 years old. You heard about climate change? There's a lot of floods going on in different areas. The parameters are different. No, they're not. So we got into an argument. Well, this is a photograph. This shows you the sedimentation that landed there after Hurricane Irene. What was even funnier was a Ford scientist that was arguing this with me in a meeting said, well, look, Mr. Stead, all due respect, I was down there the day after Hurricane Irene, and I did not see this. And I said, you were there the day after? He said, yeah. And I said, I was there the day after, and I did not see you. And he said, You are? I said, yeah. In fact, I went to lunch for like 2 hours while I was there at noon. I said to pick up lunch for the 5 interns I had crawling all over the site. And he said, which day after were you there? So eventually we got them to agree to build this. It's a lay down area. They had to lay down a lot of gravel. They had to raise the area by 15 inches before they could put any material down there to inspect. This was the whole area over here becomes the area that they raise up. They took the trees out and they raised the whole area up, and then they have to reforest it when they're done. That's the wellhead. And as you can see, they're starting to work on it. It was tough because there's underground water pipes, there's underground electrical lines. You can dig into it initially with the clamshell, but then it has to be by hand because you don't want to damage all the infrastructure that's underneath. And it was starting to get wet, pretty wet. This shows you the slope from the railroad bed. That's the track lines, and that's the river, and it slopes in that direction. There's the wellhead, and you can see all the siltation fencing that's going in now. And okay, the material wasn't toxic, was the original argument. Look at the decon area. Literally washing boots down after a week and then throwing them away. This stuff is toxic. We're not doing this because it's not toxic, but they started out in the first level of negotiation. There is nothing toxic about this material. It is benign. Lead was discovered, Alice Hamilton in 1922, the woman who discovered the impact of mercury on neurological systems, actually documented how dangerous it was to be exposed to lead. And every free nation in the world by 1952 had restricted lead use, particularly in hospitals and in public housing. Our country didn't start banning it until, interestingly enough, Richard Nixon chose to start banning it. We were the last of the free nations to say lead's not a good idea. So these are called cells, where you dig out the material by hand, and then at night you press boards and you brace them inside the bank so it doesn't fall in on itself. You can see the water line there. In this shot, you can see that as they're trying to do that to keep it from caving in, all this material is turning blue. And that's because all of the coloring agents in the paint is, because the ground is so wet, is coming back out and into the basin area. Before they can leave, they have to be able to probe 3 feet further down to make sure there's no indicator of lead below what they've dug into. And at the same time, dig out one cell at a time, brace it, and then go to the next one. It's tricky. This is interesting. Electrical lines indicated where they actually buried the lines in the paint. United Water, remember them, they were Suez, or Suez became United Water. They said in 1994, they said to me, we dug those electric lines in there, there's no paint. Look, see that musty color, that's paint, and the blue is the paint, that's all paint. They said they never saw any paint. Plus it smells to high heavens, it'll make your eyes tear. So I guess they weren't, I don't know, they were all, I don't know, had colds or something. They didn't smell it or see it. The same year, the water company said, in 94 to 2007, they had never encountered any paint. In 2007, they admitted there was paint there. I mean, we got heaps of it there. It's a well field. You're drinking the water there. But they kept saying there was none, and what little was there was benign. Look at that stuff, guys. And the Ramapos, they're in the front line. Yeah, you were exposed if the material got down to the wells, if it got drawn into what was being the access to the well point, and it didn't. As best we know, it didn't, because the filtering and the testing of the wellheads hasn't shown that it did. It got drawn down, but it didn't reach that because we did this cleanup. Ramapos live with this every day. So we'll go to Ringwood, and that's in the borough there. And the EPA had a plan to have the waste removed from what's called the O'Connor waste field, and they agreed to that plan after a lot of negotiation. There's my colleague, Michael Edelstein, with some students from Ramapo College, and there they are, excuse me, they're talking to Jack Walker. He's no longer with us. And they had they agreed to doing this, and in the 11th hour, they switched their plan and decided to let Ringwood build a recycling center on top of the waste material. Now, there's still the Peters mine and the Cannon mine. Those are 2 other separate issues in the same site, but at least the surface material was going to be cleaned up. And without any residents knowing about this, they switched the plan. So they proposed that to the EPA, and the EPA said they were going to approve it. That would be the first time in the history of this country that an industrial site was built on a cap on top of toxic waste that has access to the aquifer. That wouldn't be happening in Saddle River. So Edelstein's class is walking around. Oh, this is a wonderful woman. She's no longer with us. That's Vivian Milligan. She was a clan mother of the Turtle Clan. And she's doing a little tour with the class, and she's pointing to every house and naming all the names of the people who have either died or who are currently struggling with numerous cancers at every house in the community. That's her house right up there, and this is one of their failed cleanups. They would come in and do a little cleanup because it was surface stuff and it was unsightly. So we're in 2014, and the students are walking along Peters Mine Road, and they see this material. This is the path that goes to the school bus for the kids. That's the spring that the elders remember before Ford came along was clear water. Where it comes out of the rock, people would go and do like the old-fashioned days. They would bring their jugs and gather water there. The water comes out looking like dirty orange juice now. So death is a constant in the community, as cited by Edelstein students. During their assessment work, a combination of an environmental and social stigma make these people in this land so vulnerable. They live in perpetual jeopardy. There are little things like this, little sites like this, little sacred sites all over the place. This is Jan Barry. He's a writer for the Bergen Record. He wrote the Toxic Legacy series with a team of other writers, and Tom Franklin was the head photographer on that. It was a great series. It was in the Bergen Record. That was when a local newspaper actually covered local news. And it was a really important series because a lot of people who knew nothing about this learned about it for the first time. In this particular quote, he was fed up because he was back doing another walkabout with members of the Ford team, and they were walking over the same material. And these are EPA people in the yellow boots walking over the same material they had seen only a few years earlier and walking on it like it's perfectly harmless. And he lost his composure. He was furious. So he dug deeper into who was responsible and who was doing this stuff. And at a time when public sentiment tends toward apathy and surrender to a dominant presence, Barry challenged the reader to take notice. He was the guy, no matter what you've heard about Agent Orange, Barry was on the ground and did the real groundwork for exposing the Agent Orange horror of what the Vietnam veterans went through in terms of their exposure and the cover-up that the industry went through, or the length that they went to keep from being held responsible for all of those deaths. And still, people are still dying. Jan is currently doing surgery because of his exposure to Agent Orange in Nam. But because of those things, he had a tremendous sensitivity to what was going on up there. Okay, this gets a little sad. Ramapos are familiar with illness and death. Paul Van Dunk with a photograph of his beautiful daughter. And on the right, cousin Kelly DeGroat with a photograph of her son Colin, who died horribly at age 10. And if you ever see the film Man v. Ford, that's the ceremony in the film when they're the balloons for Colin. That's what's going on there. Here's Mickey Van Dunk, who was a boy. He fished for walleye and caught turtles for soup. He and his friends molded paint sludge into baseballs to play with. They were constantly being told by the manor, the Ringwood Borough, and by the truck drivers, and by Ford, the material is perfectly harmless. It's like Play-Doh, and kids would play with it. It was also sweet, like I said, with the animals. Kids would make it into chewing gum. They would chew it. Mickey, as you can see, bared a lot of spoils and scars, and he had 27 surgeries since he was a teen. He's no longer with us. His mother is no longer with us. Vivian's father. Most of the people that you're looking at, there are plenty of Ramapos left, but most of the ones that I've worked with back in the mid-teens there are gone. Here's another site along Peters Mine Road. The O'Connor waste field is right on the other side of that fence, decorated with reminders of lives lost. So let's get back to how do we create the data trail so that we can create the argument so that Ford can have its arm twisted to start doing some cleanup, at least on the New York side where I was initially working. Moss grows over the material. Moss doesn't require nutrients from the soil, so it can grow right onto a toxic material and do fine, captures the dew in the morning, and it works with that. And this made finding the waste a little bit challenging. The small animals of the forest, they don't seem to be bothered by it. They do pick up a certain amount of the material, but not enough to seem to alter them. Remember, they have shorter lifespans. These guys, the herbivores, they're eating the plants. The plants pick up the material. It does phytoremediate into the roots and into the stalks of the plants. It doesn't reach all the way up to the acorns like the myth was in Ringwood, but it does get up into the stalks of the plants where these guys are doing a lot of eating. The clover, this kind of a clover right here, the red clover, it did show indications of contamination. So we knew these guys were getting contaminated. But again, they have shorter lives and they're only picking up so many parts per million. So we had to look to the predators like this guy here, the red fox. When the predator eats a bunch of those animals, it biomagnifies, it builds up. And this is what we found both in Torne Valley and in Ringwood, that foxes and raccoons, for their age, and we couldn't understand what were their other exposures, that they were getting mange and they were dying. And it seemed that they were dying prematurely and they didn't have any natural predators. And we found remains. And the remains were indicating that these animals had died prematurely. And it was hard to find full intact remains because the scavengers come and get the remains and break them up. But the bone structure was brittle for an animal that would have been the age that we were calculating they were. So that was another clue that something was happening to these animals. Again, we had to create this data line. The age of the animal is determined by the condition of the teeth and the clarity of the sutures in the skull. So in this image, you've got a skull cap. This is white-tailed deer because they're eating the paint too. And on the left, the cap shows, let me see, on the left, I want to make sure I get the reading right, a younger white-tailed deer, while the skull cap on the right is of an older one. So the coronal suture, that's the squiggly line, this is an immovable joint that runs transverse across the skull, separating the frontal bone from the parietal bones. And in the younger one, there's no doubt that this is a healthy animal. It's clear, it's well articulated. And in the older animal, it's starting to fuse. So this is one of the ways you can tell the difference of an animal's age when you find the skull. The other way you could do it is if you could find bone marrow. And I was hunting all over with these remains to find bone marrow. I won't go through all of this with you right now, but the reality is we didn't find bone marrow. The scavengers were pulling the bone. That's the delicious part. So they're sucking out the bone marrow. The bone marrow is your red and white cells and your platelets. And the bone marrow would indicate abnormalities. And those are the kinds of abnormalities we're looking at. We're looking for monocytes. They're in the blue. That means if we found them in a blood smear under a microscope, under a lighter microscope stage, we knew there was an infection going on. But it could go a little further. We could get the myelodysplastic syndrome, which is an MDS, and that would have these little metal rings, these copper rings, see around the cells, and that would indicate something really powerful was going on, that this animal was, their immune system had been attacked. But again, we didn't find this. The yellow marrow is the older marrow, and the red marrow is the younger marrow. And what we learned in studying this is that when the animal is contaminated, when it's in trouble and it's older, if it's been impacted in some way, the yellow marrow can turn back into younger marrow. It can become red marrow. So it can build more red blood cells. It's amazing. I mean, I never knew that. That's very exciting to learn that it can actually reverse its own growth tendency to support the immune system of the animal. But having learned that, we couldn't prove it, so we went back to the bones. Here again is the older raccoon skull on the left and the younger one on the right. And the older one, you can barely see the sutures in this one. And on the right, you can see them quite clearly. And that was the case in all the skulls that we found. We studied mink, but realized the mink, they were healthy, they were doing good. And we realized the mink in the area had a much wider habitat range because they had the entire Torne Brook and a good portion of the Ramapo River. That being the case, they were only eating some of the herbivores that were in the area. And mostly the mink were eating the pygmy trout that were actually in the river. And then we studied the plants because there was a proliferation of Queen Anne's lace. There's a lot of Queen Anne's lace. And we discovered that Queen Anne's lace, when we got into the botany of this thing, does well with contaminated soil, oddly enough. So when we saw bunches of it, we probed down into the heart of those bunches, and that soil had lead in it. So it was starting to tell us, hey, come look over here. I think there's some lead in here, which was kind of interesting. We also studied worm casings because, as you know, the worms, they dig their tunnels by eating soil and then pooping it out in these little casings, these little balls. You see them in the springtime, these little balls. So we thought, well, if the soil is contaminated, but we can't see the paint, but we think this is an area that's got contamination, let's analyze the casings. And we made a slurry, we analyzed them, and we found them to be rich with lead parts per million. So that was important because who eats the worms? As it says in the text, the robins eat the worms. So now the contamination is gathering further, and just like with the predators, it's gathering further and further out. It's reaching further out. It's migrating further out. During this time, we built this 200-year-old ironworkers house, reassembled it. It came from the hamlet, and used it as our center for our research and the work that we were doing. It's right up on Torne Valley Road, and we got Ford to pay for the materials to build it. We built it, but they paid for the materials. And during the assembly of this, I moved a lot of the sustainability classes to a warehouse right down the road. Being in that location, we had members from the Hamlet community and Ramapo Indians wander into the class and participate with the students. And some of the stories and some of the exchange that started happening there was just golden. It was just perfect. So my students came up with this map eventually from all their research by 2017. And then getting Ford on board, they got their company, Arcadis, that was a remediation company that worked for them, to reproduce using our map. You can see those little blobs in there indicate the areas my students found. And you can see doing ground penetrating radar, they found a lot more. They started with our areas and they kept spiraling out. And they came up with this map, which was their feasibility study, producing their proposal for what they would do. What's important here is, as opposed to that earlier escapade in the 90s, which I had participated in, we said, oh, they're doing it. Okay, good. And we let them alone, and they did it, and they did a half-ass job, just like happens in Ringwood. So what's important here is I had a town supervisor who negotiated my right to be in on everything. Ooh, that ticked Ford off. And it even ticked off Arcadis. So I started working on that doctorate I told you about. And then I got some letters behind my name, and then they started, I don't know, behaving. So in the beginning, they dropped 770 trees. This is in Torne Valley. Look, there's the little salt box way over there. So that's how many trees they dropped. And all of those trees are now considered contaminated. So all of them have to be destroyed. They put up a fence. This is willow wattle for siltation control, but it's also a snake fence, as you're going to see here. Rattlesnakes are a protected species. Like copperheads, they cannot climb. So a fence, they cannot climb a fence. So every morning we had a herpetologist walk the perimeter. I did this with him, and we verified that the snakes hadn't climbed the fence. But we found other snakes that do, because black snakes are really good tree climbers, and they go right over the fence. And we had to capture them and put them back. Once the actual excavation starts, all the snakes run away because they feel it. There it's starting up there. You can see the salt box way in the back. The tarps are, when it's dry, it's dusty, and you can't let this stuff get into the air. There's a chunk that's a pretty big chunk that they found right there up north of the salt box. They dug down toward the salt box, and you can see here, it just kept getting deeper. That was interesting. Somebody was making an effort to bury it deeper, and it was layered. So they were burying it, and when it would harden, they would come back, backfill it, and bury some more, like a cake. It's like a layer cake. I eventually found the people who did that, who worked to do that. And they admitted all of that, almost proudly. That's how close they got to the salt box. We were a little afraid we were going to have to take the salt box down. 9 feet, literally 9 feet to that door. Look how deep it got. And look at these boulders. And they had to move the boulders to get to the paint. I talked to the young lady who was the niece of a guy, a contractor in Ramapo, who actually pushed boulders on top of the paint that they were dumping in. And she was sitting in his lap on the machine that he was using. And he was laughing, telling people, no one's going to look under these things. This is an area that had been an area created for an outflow for flooding back in the days of the sand quarries. And it was, this whole bank here was full of paint. And we put in siltation fence to keep it from raining into the brook. and then started digging up the bank and discovered it went down below the water level. So we had to move the brook over, all those sandbags to control the water, and then dig down below the water level and the siltation level. This is all below the bottom of the brook down in here, because the paint had been poured down the bank and it saturated into that material. And then the winter set in, made it really difficult to do. These are boulders that were steam cleaned, and if they still registered lead, if they still tested lead positive, they had to be taken away. They had to be contained elsewhere. But if they tested lead negative, they could be used in building this, because they wanted to build things out of native rock. And this is for, again, that same outfall, because it is a flood-prone area. And that goes down to the brook. And then one day I was down in the lower part of the cleanup taking pictures. Oh, they loved it when I took pictures. Some of them would pose because they'd see me there so often. You know. And there was a backhoe, and they were, oh, whoa, wait a minute, what's that shiny thing? We haven't seen one of those yet. Turned out to be an aluminum barrel full of PCB oil, polychlorinated biphenyl oil. Turned out there was more than a dozen of them. Ford said when they learned about this, well, we didn't use PCBs. We're not taking them. They're not our responsibility. Mind you, all the soil around it is filled with lead paint. We don't know how they got there. So we went back to the records and found they used PCBs in thousands of tons of things. So they did. But they were quick to lie about it because nobody had talked PCBs yet. So they had to take them out as well. So they're the two areas. This was down in the wellfield in 2013, and that's the exposed area up in the Torne Brook in 2014. And look at the numbers. In the wellfield, we got 42,000 tons of waste. In the Torne Valley, another 55,000 tons of waste. An additional site was discovered in 2015, right in the middle of the work in Torne Valley, right on north of the brook. And it was not worked until 2018. It got held off for, well, because of this. Now, you probably have heard the name Christopher St. Lawrence. Somebody in this room has heard that name. And it's probably not connected to the nicest of things. That may be the case. We all know he got indicted. We all know that he inflated the worth of the town so he could build a ballpark. We know those things. But what Christopher St. Lawrence did was he supported all the work that I was doing, put me in a position that gave me tremendous leverage. He supported the building of the salt box, the Ford cleanup, the medicine garden, the prayer circle. That's part of what the natives were doing. Supported all of that stuff and got in their face anytime I needed him to. You need a politician, even if he's a wacky one. You need a politician who's been given some authority. Except he was about to lose his authority. See, there he is in the two different places that we're working. He got indicted. It's kind of interesting to look into, well, who actually squealed on him? And that's telling in and of itself. This man, Yitzi Ullman, I know Yitzi quite well, he became the interim supervisor, and he came to the salt box one day and he said, teaching environmental stewardship, we have no business in this, because I had a whole class there. And he also said, we don't do history, so we're going to get rid of the building. He was pretty audacious, right? I ignored him. The new town administration said, well, the cleanup was going to have to stop unless Ford paid the town, the new town administration after St. Lawrence was gone, $100,000. Conversation went like this. You want your cleanup to continue? Get Ford to write us a check for $100,000. So I said to the individual saying this, can you give me the spelling of your name? And yeah, sometimes you just can't be subtle. They said, get it. So what I did was I contacted the Public Service Commission, and I had them meet me at the salt box with Ford and with the town's lawyers. And I told them this had been said. Didn't happen. We wanted to finish everything. So there we are working on that final site that my students found, pulled a chunk of paint out of the ground in 2017. Again, he always started at square one. Ford said there's no paint there. We dragged Ford over. We had them look at it. This is the Arcadis people, and they found the paint there. 60-year-old paint, guys. Look, it's drippy. You break it open, and it's drippy. It's sticky. Okay, so it was a large volume of paint there. We discovered about 6,000 tons. We made plans to return to the site in 2018 for a thorough cleanup. In the meantime, Ford was told of the $100,000 request at the salt box. We had that meeting and they laughed. Now Ford is laughing. And they said, this is absurd, Chuck. The CEO from Dearborn said, Chuck, you fought us for almost 20 years to get us to clean up your watershed. And now the recipients of the cleanup, you are having to fight to get us to be allowed to finish. This is absurd. And I said, yeah, it is. It's copying. It's bizarre. What do I say? And they said, you say nothing. We're here. We got our equipment. They're not getting in our way. We're doing it now. I mean, they literally sent cops up there and they told the cops, go away. We're digging. Can't you see we're doing something here? I mean, they stuck to it because they spent millions and they were near the end of it now. So, although the town chief had moved to fire me in the end of 2017, I refused to go. She said, we're not paying you anymore. I had a civil service position. I said, I don't care. You don't pay me enough anyway. I'm staying here. Well, you don't have a desk. I said, I don't need a desk. I got a salt box. They said, well, you don't have a salt box. I said, I'll have the woods. You know, I'm not going. I'm staying here till we get rid of the paint. She literally said to me, the chief of staff said to me, there is nothing wrong with lead paint. You know this. Anyway, I refused to leave, and Ford and DEC were on track to complete the whole thing, and they were happy with me hosting our meetings. There's MEVO, that's a Mall volunteer group. They were up there. Meanwhile, back up in Ringwood, things were not going well. Here's the Wanacue Reservoir. This is the area with the paint sludge. That little red dot is the area where there's a recycling center. And what the Ford Motor Company offered, I told you this earlier, was they would cap the O'Connor waste field and build a state-of-the-art recycling center right in the middle of this red chunk for the borough of Ringwood, and that's revenue. It would cost Ford infinitely less than cleaning up the paint. And the borough loved it. They said, let's do it. What's worse is the EPA loved it. And they said, it hasn't happened yet, but the EPA loved it too. So there's got to be a lot of money floating around here. Meanwhile, in 2016, there's Vivian Milligan, and she was still with us, literally pleading with the EPA. That's one of the EPA people there, Walter Mudgeon, and she's pleading with him. Don't build this center. Remove this stuff like you said you were going to. Oh, see, there's Catherine McCabe. She worked with New Jersey DEP. Whenever a new person works with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, they come up and do a walk around. And you can see some Ramapos are there, and there's Wayne Mann, there's Chief Mann, there's Vivian Milligan right in the middle of it all. And they do a little walkabout. That was what year? 2018. She hasn't been back. But boy, was she concerned that day. But Rutgers University, remember I mentioned Rutgers earlier, Rutgers jumped in on this thing and said, let's help you with the project that you're doing. So I got their ecological landscaping course under Anita Bakshi to work on finding where the tunnels were in the Cannon and Peters mine, because the records were tissue paper thin. But there were records, so they were going to try to trace them together and see what they could do. And from that came this book, Our Land, Our Stories. I have a copy of it here if you want to look at it. This is the current cover. And it's got a lot of really good information in there. It's got the students' work in there. Students, as you can hear from what I'm saying, have had a lot to do with getting a lot of this stuff out into the public's eye. In June 2018, the Youth Bureau, the Conservation Corps, a lot of workshops were happening up there. Rutgers were going to help us build a Dutch barn that RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, was going to design, and we got it from the Historical Society of Rockland County. We got this old Dutch barn that George Torrell actually had disassembled years earlier. And we were going to put it right alongside the salt box so we could build a lab, because our lab was pretty tiny. The current town didn't want any of this. Chief Mann, he hung right into the end. Here he is right up there through 2018, offering lectures and workshops. That's the prayer circle I mentioned earlier. And there's some of the elders mentioned in that text. And the Mohawk Nation had come down. They were deeply involved in this. The Hurons were involved. We had we had at least 7 Indian nations that got involved with the work that was happening in the Torne Valley. Oh, there's the RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. They're at the salt box. They were all there to support us. Look at all those people that were eager to come and participate. This was so, and it's not just people from other schools. There were people from here. There were just people from all over working on these projects. Now we get to our rattlesnakes. There's a pre-shed. This one was found not 15 feet from the main Hudson Bear Mountain Trail. That's actually the Suffern Bear Mountain Trail. It's actually mislabeled there. Right up on Torne Mountain, there's a den up there. And we tagged it, we radioed telemetry, followed this snake, and it literally cut right through the same area that we wanted to finish cleaning up by the Torne Brook. So we knew it was a rattlesnake habitat, which means it's a chief indicator species. The area, when we restore it, will not be clean until the rattlesnake returns, because that means there's enough mice there for the rattlesnake to feed on. And sure enough, that was the first one. That's right back of the salt box on one of those old beams from the Dutch barn that we got. And when we saw her there napping away, having a good, it was okay. They didn't bother us. They were fine. We made our peace with rattlesnakes. And in fact, we had a black snake living in the crawl space of the salt box. And every morning it went hunting and circled the salt box. And at the height of season, rattlesnakes won't cross over a black snake's permanent trail. So the black snake sort of protected us. And my kids learn a lot about snakes. I did too. We learned a whole lot about snakes. I needed assurance that when this was done, the snakes would be protected still. The rattlesnake is a threatened species in New York State. You cannot impact upon the rattlesnake. And so that where their dens are located and the peripheral habitat is, you cannot do this. And this is one of the ways that we can keep excessive development from happening. Look, that extra area I talked about, see 6,000 tons were found there. That means in Torne Valley, 100,000 tons total. But the new administration in the town of Ramapo told me snakes are not our concern. And by Thanksgiving 2018, I was back at Sloan Kettering, because we all get cancer in this area. I had cancer and I'd had it 2 surgeries, and then I had a problem with a strangulated hernia from one of the surgeries. So I was back at Sloan Kettering, which means I'm not in Torne Valley. When I returned, I was locked out of the salt box. I was told to empty it of my belongings. I just had surgery. They didn't care. They said, hire somebody to move your stuff out of there. If it's not out by the end of the year, it's our stuff. This was a library, artifacts. It was a lot of important stuff that was all part of the story, and I didn't want it to be lost. It was lab equipment. It was my microscopes. I love this picture of, can any of you know Mr. Speck, the town supervisor? Does he look a little bit lost in that picture, looking at these proposals for land development? Yeah. He has no idea what he's reading. But I don't even want to tell you his salary. And then in the summer of 2020, in the afternoon on a Sunday, there was a mysterious fire. It was a brush fire. According to the cops that were there, it was fueled. And it went right up the bank and almost got the salt box. On a Sunday, hardly anybody was up there. But, because people work up in the valley, but hikers saw it, called it in the Hillburn Fire Department, put it out. Chief man of the Ramapo Turtle Clan has now requested, or actually requested in 2020, just before COVID hit, to have the area returned to the authority of the tribe. It was a strong request. Nothing. Mind you, when St. Lawrence was supervisor, the tribe was promised they would always have access to the area. In fact, they named the garden the Ramapo Medicine Garden. Ramapo spelled R-A-M-P-O-U-G-H, Medicine Garden. And we grew sage and sweetgrass for the tribe down there. No. But it's not all bad. Torne Valley is all clean. We know of no place else. I know where there's pain, but not in that valley right now. So at least we got that much done. And that's it, guys. Questions? Thank you. Thank you. Yes. It was a private area that was owned by the Ramapo Land Company. That's a private concern. That's a land company. They owned it. No, it's in the town of Ramapo, but it was all private property. So the town didn't have oversight on it. And I know this because my brother-in-law, the man who I showed you the picture of, he worked for the land company. And he knew the dumping was going on. And so when they sent him back to find it, he knew where to look. Because he worked for the company since the mid-1950s, since Ford began. So is that good? Yeah. But understand something. What we got done in Ramapo was because we could prove the town of Ramapo government didn't have any responsibility. It had all happened when it was in private hands. In Ringwood, the O'Connor Waste Field and the Peter and Cannon Mine, which I didn't even talk to you about, those three areas are all under the authority of the borough of Ringwood since the late 1950s. So any paint dumped there was dumped there with their knowledge, and also they were paid for. So to clean up Ringwood means they're also involved. Now, Pat Seppi with the EPA said probably what would happen is Ringwood would be included in on the cost, and it would probably cost Ringwood maybe as much as $30 to $40 million. But it would cost Ford, given the amount of paint that was there, well over $100 million. Remember, in Torne Valley, they spent $40 million. But in Ringwood, there's 250,000 tons that we know of. In Torne Valley, it was 100,000 tons. And in Ringwood, there are complications that could make it cost even a good deal more. So you could see why the borough of Ringwood doesn't want to be involved, because they feel they would go broke. They have insurance. They have insurance like any municipality does. It'll cost a fortune. The insurance will cover it. And all the people who are in office will probably not be voted back in again, because it happens on their watch. But it didn't happen on their watch. It actually happened on the watch of people who are long gone now and who probably pocketed money, as best as we can tell. They should do the right thing. But the only politician in my whole story that did the right thing was the wacky politician, my friend Chris St. Lawrence. And to this day, if I bring him up in a good light, there will be people who will say, you are all wrong about him. You are all wrong about him. Well, I worked with him. You know, that's that. So anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if your body goes through stress, let's say you break your leg and your body's in stress, and you've lost blood, you can get transfusions, but your body will know that it needs to build up its red cell count. It'll know it has to do this because it's losing its cells, or its blood cells are losing oxygen. It has to enrich itself. The yellow bone marrow in your bone, it's in the tube, like in the hollow part of your bone, can actually revert back to its earlier version from 20, 30, 40 years ago and enrich itself. They've only really learned this in like the last 20 some odd years, but this is so fascinating because it means we actually rejuvenate. I imagine you've heard that as you get older, you lose your brain cells. You don't have as many as you had before. No, now they've discovered you're building new brain cells all the time. You do build new brain cells. Other things may cause you forgetfulness and issues like that, but you do rejuvenate brain cells because your body recognizes that brain cells are starting to break down. And in order to function, you need brain cells. This is what that whole notion of pluripotentiality and stem cells is all about. It's really, there's a tremendous science there, and we're only tapping the surface to really understand it, but it's a reality that we really can rejuvenate, and we should learn this because rejuvenation is like what we're trying to do in the Torne Valley or what we need to do in Ringwood. It's recovery. And we know how to make ourselves sick. So it'd be good to figure out how to make ourselves well. You know. Yes. I had liver surgery. They took out 70% of my liver because I had tumors, because I was exposed to this stuff. My dad and I used to harvest ramps. You know what ramps are? It's a rich green, iron-enriched ground cover. And we used to eat it right. You saw that sticky paint where that sticky part was? That's where we used to, in the springtime, go up and sit there tossing stuff in to try to get the crawdaddies out of the brook and eating ramps. And they were growing in highly contaminated soil at that point. Probably that's what happened to me. But my liver rejuvenated once the portions that were in bad shape were removed, because your liver can rejuvenate. You can encourage it. There are various things you can do to encourage it, both medically and both in terms of preventative health care. You can build up a richer, more stable immune system. But there's a lot of indigenous work. When I was going through my cancer phases, I ate lots of wild berries. Wild berries, strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, the best thing for you. In fact, I even got from Canada an essence called sylvesterol, which is the essence of wild berries. And I ate 4 tablets of that a day. So I was maxing out on the essence of wild berries, but also the fresh berries and frozen berries when I couldn't get them fresh. And I was also doing vitamin C drips, which helped tremendously. And I did well. I mean, I'm bouncing around. No, he didn't. He didn't. But my exposure would be when I was young. And his exposure would be when he was older. And when you're younger, it's an interesting thing. You're metabolically going through various changes. That's why so many children have died in Ringwood. So there's levels of exposure. Plus you're little and you get down and you mess around with stuff, So I think that was it, but I don't know. My father was just hardy as hell, 92 and kicking around when, before he went. Smoking a pipe until he was 91. Started smoking when he was 8. Somebody else? In the back? Oh, God. Okay, everything. But the main problem with Avon, and this you should all be aware of, is the heavy metals that were in the cosmetics. And okay, now I'm going to sound like back in Ramapo teaching. Do not use antiperspirant. Do not use it. You can use deodorant if it has no aluminum. Make sure it has no aluminum, aluminum-free. You can get that. Tom's of Maine is aluminum-free deodorant. But don't use antiperspirant because you were designed by evolution, by God, by whatever, to perspire. So if you seal your pores and do not perspire, the junk that's looking to egress your body gets stuck there. So you just take some shellac if you want to seal your pores and brush it on. And where do the lymph nodes become contaminated in a woman? Usually between the nipple and the pit, right in here. And that's because you're piling up the junk and you're stressing the system. So you don't use antiperspirant, you use a deodorant that doesn't have aluminum. Aluminum saturates the system and plugs it as well. And also you don't want additional heavy metals in your system. We just get them from breathing. But you don't want to add to that because that becomes the load that impacts upon you. So with Avon, it was tons of stuff that had aluminum chlorhydrate in it. And some of you may go home tonight and open your medicine cabinet and you may see, and I'm not saying you, but you may find an Avon roll-on for deodorant. And you take it down and look at the back of it. And when you see alum chlorhydrate, alum, because they shortened it when they didn't, and they said using the word aluminum might be bad now, so they just shortened it to alum. When you see that, don't do as my mother did. Oh, it's okay, I'll just use it till it's over and then I'll try. No, throw it out right away. Get rid of it. Because you're building up, you're building up the impact upon your system. My mom had Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed with full-blown Alzheimer's. We did blood screening. We found she had a high level of aluminum in her system. She had 4 Avon ladies in her family. From 1939 until 1992, she was, and lipstick, there's lead, lanthan is lead, and it's in lipstick. Just read ingredients. The EPA says you don't have to put the ingredients on a cosmetic because it's not a food or a drug. No. You don't use a cosmetic if it doesn't have ingredients listed on it, because if it doesn't have something listed on it, then there's a reason for that. So my mom had Alzheimer's, and we chelated her. That's non-toxic intravenous fluid into the system, through infusions. And then if it's working by measuring urine analysis to see if parts per million of aluminum are coming out of her system. And at 10 weeks, And as we saw those parts per million increase, she became clear-headed again. I saw this with my own eyes. I saw it working. It's not quack therapy. In fact, it's patented by the United States Navy. And that's because the people painting submarines in 1947 with lead paint on the hulls of ships were getting neuropathy. And a German doctor who had repatriated to this country said, well, he had a system that will help that stuff flush out of their bodies, help the metals flush out. And everybody said, that's quackery. And they tried it and the guys got well again. So the US Navy patented chelation. So you can look it up, spelled chelation, chelation. There are doctors that do this with infusions, and they, depending on what they find in your blood, they can help it. If it's metal bonded, they can encourage it to go out of your system. So they had that kind of stuff in that dump up there. And Avon, and Ledley. Ledley has its own toxic landfill behind the plant. You know where the Ledley plant was in Pearl River? And now it's a whole bunch of other names, but because it's a big consortium of different things over there. If you walk behind there, beyond the railroad track in Muddy Creek, there is a capped landfill with PVC pipes for the off-gassing of methane that's in there because it's filled with animals, you know, the animals that they tested on. And it's filled with a lot of other stuff. And it's not a Superfund site. It's a private site that's highly toxic. And when the brook, the Muddy Brook floods at the end of winter, the saturation comes right out of that landfill. It's not it's capped with soil, nothing else. There's no geotech or anything. So come on, man. Avon, the pharmaceutical, American cyanamide. There's a lot of stuff in there. And poor little, you could look this up. Montvale, the little Jersey town just below Pearl River. Okay, look up. You have to do some Google searches to find this. Wonderfish, catfish. My dad brought me down to see them when I was a little boy. There's a little ponding area down that creek, and there were catfish that the kids were pulling out of that creek that were the size of catfish they would pull out of the river delta in the Mississippi. You know, catfish will grow according to the size of its habitat, but these were too big for that pond. And nobody understood this. This was in the late 50s. So scientists from Ledley went down there and they grabbed some of these catfish from the kids and they brought them up, and they were full of steroids. They were full of steroids that Avon had been experimenting with, and found the experiments were amounting to nothing and threw it out in their landfill. So then they found, oh, but wait, this does work. So did you have, oh, yes.
Where does all this good stuff go to after it leaves Ramapo?
It goes to 4 places. 2 of them are in Jersey, but the least volatile stuff is in New Jersey. They're in containment areas, like the boulders I told you about, or the trees that need to be chipped up and contained. And they go into containment areas. And those are like little bolts. And they don't have much. They have very tiny indications. Now the soil goes to Dearborn. Ford has a giant compound in Dearborn where it contains all of this contaminated soil from not just our site. And what they're doing is trying to figure out ways, they have scientists working on this, to naturalize those soils. If that can be, because it's a great rich soil full of horrible stuff. If they can do this successfully, they will leap ahead of everybody else in the world in dealing with contaminants. And all of a sudden, they'll be very honest and upfront about contamination because they'll have the patent on how to neutralize contaminated soil. So that's going on. But the chunks of paint, like you saw, they go to a toxic waste incinerator in Utah. And there it gets burned down and melted. And the VOCs go up the stacks, and there are various biofilters in the stacks, each one designed to capture that particular volatile organic compound that's in the effluent. And the lead eventually boils all the way, like in an iron furnace. It all drips out in the bottom, gets molded into casts, and gets locked into a mountain, a vault in a mountain, for safekeeping. Because one day we may need lead again. And when we do, we won't have to mine it because we got tons of lead in these bricks locked into this mountain. I know it's a little science fiction-y, but that's what they do. They have these vaults on railroad cars specifically designed to hold these big blocks of lead inside these mountains. Yes?
have a couple of questions from Zoom.
Oh, good. Zoom.
How safe is the sports complex on Torne Valley Road?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say the inside is safe. That's in the bubble, or not the bubble, the building, the gymnasium. I don't talk about bubbles, so we'll talk about the building. But the turf is artificial turf. So that's safe because it's capped over something else, but there's no geotextile embedded beneath the artificial turf. So when the Ramapo River floods and the saturation pushes up through the soil into that turf in that ball field there, that football field there, that's problematic. Now what happens is the turf, because it's artificial turf, bubbles. It looks kind of odd because it's plastic, it's not real turf. And so that material theoretically is contained under it, but you can see the puddles emerging from it. So I would say that that is questionable primarily in the springtime. I would say that, or after heavy rain, like if we have a heavy storm in the summer. So I would stay off, the town's gonna love me for this. I would stay off the ball field after a heavy rain or after the thaw. Because the moisture brings stuff up. We don't know that they got it all down there. I know in the areas I worked in what they got, but we don't know that they got it all. Also, the Ramapo River, when it floods at flood stages, is bringing petrochemicals down from upstate. So it can move other stuff. That's another problem.
A couple more questions. Fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Have you approached any TV producers, streaming sites?
No. But I do a podcast, but I mean that's little. I mean I don't know anybody in that business. So it'd be a good idea if nothing else to get the story out. It'd be a good idea. Yeah. I got in trouble once. Remember I told you we made videotapes of the Nature Place camp over at the Meadows. We had the kids on microphones and I put it on local cable television and 5 minutes of it was copied and showed up on PBS station in Washington, D.C. I knew nothing about this. And somebody called me and said, wow, well, you made it to Washington. I didn't know what they were even talking about. But sure enough, that was important. That's why this question is a good question. It was really important because the next day, DEC called me with a different tune. And that's because somebody in Washington whose district covered North Jersey, because that was North Jersey, Southern New York, got their nose out of joint when somebody said, did you see what was on PBS last night? Some guy is exposing children to contaminated soil. Somebody said something like this, and it does feed the trough. So that would be a good idea, yes. If anybody knows anybody, yes, I would cooperate with doing that.
One other question.
One more.
And then I'll go back to the audience. Another great presentation. Learned a lot. So where are we now? Can you mention the work we are doing with health measurements, also toxic metals and benzene still around 2024?
There's a lot of work around all of these issues that this person has commented on. One of the challenges in doing this is when we get into the science right now, because politically we're in a very strange era. We need the science, like I was talking about so much in the presentation, to create the data, to lay down the data, so we know what we're working with, and we have something that we can bring, to the discussion. So we need that science. But science is getting such a black eye from people who just hate experts. They hate scientists. They hate government. All government is bad in these people's minds, and that's not the case. All government is not bad. We're government. We have a right to participate in government. We have a right to educate to the degree. That's what the Salt Box was about. I was creating an educational center, and we were having workshops in the Salt Box so community members could come by. We literally gutted deer at the Salt Box with hunters so we could teach them how to look for tumors in the intestinal tract of the deer because they're going to eat this stuff. And there were hunters who were hunting deer in Ringwood. So we brought the deer down, we gutted them there, and out of 11 deer, we found 3 that were highly contaminated. Now, does that mean the others were completely free? Not necessarily, but it means the ones that have the tumors are indicating a large level of contamination. They know enough, don't eat that. But that was a big lesson right there. And so that kind of thing is so important. And yet, you know, we have people right now who discredit science a lot and government a lot. And so you gotta get involved. And the benzene thing is a big thing. You've got to get involved so you can know that these things, like mentioning the chlorhydrates in the Avon Cosmetics. I got doing a lecture at Ramapo College. I almost got fired for talking about this stuff. I did a kids show on cable television years ago, and I talked about this, and I mentioned Avon. That was the end of the show. But we need to be transparent, guys. You know, it's our health and it's our children's health. So I don't know. I kind of ran off on that one, but did that answer that question a little bit? Okay. And you, ma'am.
Where is the salt box? What is the status of it now?
Well, I hope if you go see it, it's still there. It's up Torne Valley Road. If you go to Hillburn and get to Torne Valley Road.
There's nothing operating there,
No, there's nothing going on, but you'll see it. It's surrounded by mugwort because mugwort grew wild around it. So it's a lot of, bushy plant. But by the way, you can smoke mugwort. Well, if you don't want to smoke cannabis, you can smoke mugwort, and the effect is similar. Good. All right. Don't do that. Smoking's bad. I didn't say that.
My second question, I'm glad that you mentioned that film because I remember seeing on cable TV, I thought it was cable for the local, a bunch of kids, I shouldn't say kids, college students running around in trucks, finding the garbage and behind gates and things like that. And then I think interviewing a couple of people on the spot, like I think they went to a town supervisor. I know, would that be?
That wasn't in that wasn't in Man v. Ford, but that was probably my kids.
Okay.
Because we got interviewed a few times, nothing major, but we had local interviews. Oh, and Al Jazeera America actually flew out to interview us. That was so interesting. They did you can find it online. They did a 15-minute piece online in which I get interviewed and some Ramapos get interviewed. And I got mail from Germany. I mean, they have a huge following in Europe. They have a meager following here, but I got mail from Germany and people were asking a lot of the same questions.
Yes. But I do know it was the first time that I saw it.
Good. You probably saw that. You probably saw that as my kids probably. Yeah, good. Good. Years ago, Avon was, this is a funny story. Avon was, they wanted to create a indelible eyeliner. So they were injecting a compound into rabbits' eyes, in the lids of their eyes, and actually in the tissue of their eyes to understand what this material did to the rabbit. So I learned about this from one of the technicians, and I was, I'm not going to do that to our little bunny rabbits. So I got a bunch of hippies together. This is years ago. I got a bunch of hippies together, and in the late 60s, and we went over to Avon, and I stood on a car hood and held up a toy bunny rabbit and a spray paint can to demonstrate this is what your lovely Avon ladies are up to. I was doing this, and a security guard was really, mad, because this, and he knocked me down, hit me in the legs, and I fell on the car hood. I didn't know it was the president's car from Avon, and I put a good dent in it.
They have a big fence now.
Yeah, they do for not just for the rattlesnakes, but for me. But then years later, when I learned this about the cosmetics, I was doing cable television when we had a TKR cable, and I contacted Avon and said, I'm going to do a program on my mother's Alzheimer's. And we found the source of it is in your cosmetics. But it's only fair to let you know this if you want to rebuttal, or you want to be on the show, or you want to do your own show and everything. And I figured that was the best way to approach it. And the response I got from a VP there said, we're not the only ones putting metal in our makeup, which means they knew about this before I called. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Somebody said, secret, somebody said.
Well, like
Could use
secret,
a little
yeah.
more con- works the best.
What's that? Yeah. Lenthic, the red lipstick in the 1960s, red dye lipstick was Lenthic. And they advertised, I have the advertisements on this in one of my lectures. They advertised Lenthic, the most durable of colors to apply to your pores. Why would you do? But, and it's a beautiful woman. And she looks great. She's putting on the red lipstick. Yeah. That's scary. That's scary. Yes, sir. Hi. Hey, Gordon.
Thank you for your ringing endorsement of science. Would you like to say anything about interdisciplinary education, of which you are a living, walking, breathing, powerful embodiment?
Thank you. Yes, interdisciplinary education. It's what Ramapo College used to tout in their literature. It's what we do so little of anymore, but it's what those of us who believe in it need to do. To learn a specialized thing without understanding its relationship to anything else is to learn very little in terms of having an operational understanding of what actually exists. So I'm a big fan of as you can tell, I'm a big fan of that. And in my course, one of the courses I developed for Ramapo was called Ecology, Society, and the Sacred. And I talked about science, natural science, and then I talked about traditional ecological knowledge, because we've learned so much, particularly me, particularly from my friend Alicia Cook, the medicine woman with the Akwesasne Nation up on the border, the Canadian border, about their understanding and how that enhances my understanding, and yet we're talking about the same stuff. So there's so many ways to know a thing. And it doesn't mean that science is wrong. It means it's not finished. There's not a completion point. We're all still learners. So yeah, and I know, Gordon, I know you're a big believer in this too. So thank you for bringing that up. Yep. Yeah. So guys, anything else?
One more question from Zoom.
Oh, Zoom.
This is from Judy Zakoff.
Oh yeah. Hi, Judy. If she's there.
She's there. And she's made a comment, Texas Metals and Plants and Soil in 2024 by our NYU group.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure what that means.
She's working with NYU, doing a study, doing an examination of what was going on with the metals, both in the plants and the animals and so forth. And she was also working on a health survey study of Ramapos and people within that same region up there in the Turtle Clan country, which the state has never done. And we've been asking for that from the DOH from day one of all of this. So she's been really good. She's been really supportive, especially coming with her NYU credentials. So I guess that was an endorsement, and I'm endorsing her back. That was good.
One last question. This is for me. With the planned demolition of the Sheridan Hotel, where the Ford plant was, what, if anything, what plans are being made to ensure that whatever toxins might be left there is under some type of control?
I don't know. Part of that is because I spent so much time working right across the state line there. So I know a good deal more about what's going on in New York. But also because when Ford was taken down, DEP of New Jersey and DOH of New Jersey were allegedly on top of that. After it was taken down, we discovered so much stuff was still in the soil, not in the immediate footprint of the Sheraton, but all around it. In fact, when they built the Sheraton, they carted away tons of stuff. So where the regulatory agencies for the state of New Jersey were when Ford was taken down, it's anybody's guess. Now, it's a different generation of people working in these agencies. But my gut feeling from my experience with both of them, I just mentioned McCabe, who came to visit. My gut feeling is they're kind of glad EPA still has an authority up in Ringwood, because it means they don't. And that's like, okay, Pontius Pilate, you're washing your hands. You got nothing to do with the crucifixion anymore. Excuse me, you're still here. You're still a part of the story. And that infuriates me. So I think we need to really keep a close eye on that. And we need to hold them to the grindstone on this. I'm terribly concerned about it. And there are spots, there's still brown spots up there that I know of. When Jaguar came in, it was a Sharp industry, and then Jaguar came in. When Jaguar came in, their footprint was going to be wider. Now, where Sharp was built, they had to remediate the soil. Mind you, Ford said they remediated it, and they were allowed to leave just like that. So Sharp remediated where their footprint was. Jaguar's footprint is bigger. So I went over to monitor that, but it's in New Jersey, and they threw rocks at me. So I got lenses, higher powered binoculars and a higher power camera lens. And I went over into Sheraton area to watch the Jaguar area, and the Sheraton area kicked me out with their security. And then I found this little strip of land in between the two of them that nobody seemed to own. And I stayed there and I took pictures, and I saw them digging up from the ground construction material, infrastructure from Ford, that Ford had planted there, that they discovered. So when they left, I went over at night, I did some soil samples, it was full of lead. So I went back to New Jersey DOH and said, there's lead up there, you got to go up there and got to watch. And crickets, nothing happened. So a few days later, I followed the trucks. Where they're going to dump this stuff. This is contaminated soil. They went right around the corner over into the meadows, which we'd cleaned up, and they were dumping it down the bank. In the area that we got cleaned up in the meadows of Hillburn. So I photographed it. The people threw rocks at me, the truck drivers. And I walked up and I caught one of the rocks and I threw it back, and they laughed. And then I got up there and they said, what the hell are you doing? So I kicked some soil over and I showed them where there was some paint in there and there was some rebarb from the construction stuff. And I said, now, here's what you can do. If you want to see your grandchildren, you can wear a mask, you can wear gloves, and maybe you won't be contaminated. But that's what you're doing. Your company is exposing you to contamination and they know it's here. So I got calls that I was being a bad guy again. But there's a problem with this. That's on the New York side. That's on the New York side. New Jersey was dumping over to the New York side. So I went to the New York authorities on the New York side, and that was the town of Ramapo. And this was just when St. Lawrence was getting indicted. And I was told, you're already doing enough other stuff. Don't stick your nose into that one. Mind you, this is an area we got cleaned up. I'm supposed to walk away from it? I could take you there tomorrow morning. I could show you the stuff. It's still there. And that's still a floodplain. So that's still a problem. Anyway, it's cheerful. Because we're here. We're here and we mean it. And we're not going to give up. And, this is who we are. I don't know. I'm funny sometimes. Kids, actually, no, the way I keep going is I teach kids. And kids listen. And we got a wonderful generation of kids coming up that they're being handed a load of crap. And we have to help them. It's our responsibility to help them. And as long as we're honest and transparent about what we know about this stuff and work with them, and they like us, they see that we're being fair, I think most of them will work with us. And that's the hope. That's it, man. They're our future. It's like 7 generations. If we can't take care now for what's going to be then who the hell are we? So it's gonna be. Yeah, it's gonna be. It's gonna be good. We're gonna get there. Limping all the way, but we're gonna get there. Okay? We good? Thank you very much.